Hi, I'm David. Welcome to A Tale. Once a week on this channel, we tell a true story from history, the kind I stay up too late reading about, told slow enough to fall asleep to. Tonight it is the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was Queen of France and then Queen of England, and who lived so long and so largely that she buried nearly everyone in her own story. And I will tell you right at the start that her ending is a gentle one. An old woman at peace in a quiet abbey. Everything you will hear is drawn from the old chronicles and the historians who have tested them, and the sources are listed below. There are no ads waiting to wake you. So, settle in, get warm, and let an old story keep you company. Good night. Close your eyes now, if you like. This is a story, and it is true, and it asks nothing of you, except that you lie still and let it happen. And before we begin it, let me give you the ending, so that you can hold it the whole way through, the way you hold a rail on a dark stair. Tonight it is a gentle one. There was once a woman who outlived them all. She was born in the warm south of France, more than 800 years before you were. And she was a duchess at 15, and a queen at 15, and a queen again at 32 of a different country, and in between she rode to Jerusalem and back. She married 2 kings and buried both of them. She raised 10 children and buried 8, among them one of the most famous kings who ever lived. Her own husband kept her a prisoner for 16 years, and she outlived him, and outlived the prison, and came out of it somehow larger, and in her 70s, she governed England in everything but the name, ransomed a captive king with her own hands, and crossed the highest mountains in Europe in winter, on business that mattered. And at the very end, past 80, when everyone whose story had tangled with hers was gone, she folded her long life, closed like a book, and put on the plain habit of a nun, and died in her bed in the quietest place she knew, an abbey called Fontevraud on the Loire, with the sisters singing the offices around her. The nuns wrote in their register that she was a queen who surpassed almost all the queens of the world. She lies there still, between her husband and her son, and her stone likeness on the tomb does a thing no other queen's does. It reads, "They carved her holding an open book, as if death itself were only a long, quiet evening, and she had brought something to pass the time." So hold that. Nothing that happens in this story can take her from you. Not the crusade, not the annulment, not the rebellion, not the 16 locked years. Every one of those rooms has a door, and she walks out of all of them, and the last room of all is warm, and hers, and chosen. You know the harbor. It is a lamp-lit abbey on a slow river, and the ship comes home to it old, and full, and finished, with every sea in the world in her wake. Let the story take its time now. It has more than 80 years to cross, and it is in no hurry, and neither are you. She was born around the year 1122 in the duchy of Aquitaine, which was the great warm southwest of what is now France, and you should let yourself see it, because she carried it inside her all her life, into every cold northern room they ever put her in. Aquitaine was the largest and richest domain in the whole kingdom of France, bigger by far than the lands the King of France himself actually ruled. It ran from the river Loire in the north down to the wall of the Pyrenees in the south, vineyard country and river country, wheat and salt and wine, and the light longer and softer than in the north. And its court was like nowhere else in Europe. Her grandfather, Duke William IX of that name, was a crusader and a scandal, and above all, a poet, the very first of the troubadours, whose songs we still have. Songs were currency in that family. Wit was a form of wealth. Her name, in her own soft southern tongue, was Eleanor. Her mother was named Enor, and the little girl was Elia Enor, the other Enor. Eleanor, we say now. A name that began as an echo of her mother, given to a woman the whole world would end up echoing. Her mother died when she was young, and her little brother too, and so the girl became, quite suddenly, the heir. Her father, Duke William X, was a big, restless, quarrelsome man who nonetheless did one thing very well. He took his daughter with him. Around his duchy he went, year upon year, holding courts and hearing pleas, and the girl rode with him and watched, and learned how a great land is actually held together, which is not mainly by swords. It is by knowing people and remembering them and being seen. In the spring of 1137, when Eleanor was about 15, her father set out on pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James at Compostela, over the mountains in Spain, and on the road, in Holy Week, he fell ill, and on Good Friday, at the shrine itself, he died. He was not yet 40. The men around him kept the death quiet and rode hard, because everyone understood what had just happened. A girl of 15 was now Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right, the greatest heiress in Europe, and an unmarried heiress with that much land was, in that age, not a person so much as a prize, and every ambitious man with a horse would be reaching for her the moment he heard. Her father had foreseen exactly this, and left instructions, and they went straight to the King of France. And the old king, Louis VI, fat and dying and sharp as ever, saw the offer of the century lying in front of him, marry the girl to his own son, and the vast, rich South would be joined to the French crown in a single stroke. He moved fast. Within weeks, his 17-year-old heir, also named Louis, was riding south to Bordeaux with an escort of 500 knights to be married. So picture the wedding, that July, in the Cathedral of Bordeaux, in a summer so hot the chroniclers remembered it for years. A girl of 15, dark-eyed, raised on poetry and power in equal measure. A boy of 17, tall, fair, gentle and pious, so pious, because here is the thing about young Louis. He was a second son, raised in the cloister school of Notre Dame to be a churchman, and he had loved it. And then one day in Paris, his elder brother's horse had stumbled over a pig, running loose in the street. Of all the small absurd hinges history turns on, and the brother had died of the fall, and the quiet boy from the cloister had been pulled out of his prayers and told he would be king instead. They were married, these two, the poet's granddaughter and the almost monk, and days later, as they traveled north, word came that the old king was dead. And so, by the end of that one summer, the girl who had begun the year as a duke's daughter was Duchess of Aquitaine and Queen of France at 15, and on her way to Paris, and to a life in which, we can fairly say, she was almost never again allowed to be unimportant, and almost never once asked what she wanted. Paris, when Eleanor came to it, was a growing, muddy, clever city, crowded around an island in the Seine, and the royal palace at the island's tip was old and dim and cold, and the north was cold, and the churchman who ran her husband's government looked at this vivid southern girl and her songs and her silks, the way frost looks at a hummingbird. She found it, by every sign we have, dull beyond bearing, and she was not a person who bore dullness quietly. She brightened the court because she could not help it, brought the poetry and the fashions of the South into those gray rooms, and the sober men around the throne clucked and the young king watched her, and on this the chroniclers agree. Louis loved her plainly, awkwardly, extravagantly, the way a boy raised among monks loves the one dazzling thing that has ever happened to him. One churchman wrote disapprovingly that the king loved the queen almost beyond reason. The gentle truth is that she seems to have found him good and kind and impossible. She is supposed to have said, long afterward, that she had thought to marry a king and found she had married a monk. The line comes to us secondhand, through unfriendly channels, so hold it lightly. But no historian doubts the ache underneath was real, on both sides. And the young reign stumbled, the way young reigns do. There were quarrels with the church and with great lords, and one quarrel grew into a small ugly war in Champagne. And in that war a thing happened that marked Louis for life. And we will keep the camera far away, on a hillside, at dusk, where it belongs tonight. The king's army took a town called Vitry, and fire got loose, the oldest accident of war, and it reached the church where the townspeople had taken shelter, and very many died. Louis had not ordered it. He watched from a distance, helpless, and something in the pious young man broke that day and never fully mended. And when, a few years later, terrible news came from the east, that the crusader lands around Edessa had fallen, and the great abbot Bernard of Clairvaux began to preach a second crusade to set things right, Louis reached for it with both hands. Here was a penance the size of his guilt. He would take the cross and walk to Jerusalem. And Eleanor, and this is the part that made all Europe talk, said, "So will I." Understand how strange it was, and how entirely like her. Kings had gone crusading before. Queens did not go. A queen's part was to wait, and govern nothing, and embroider something, and pray. Eleanor took the cross at Vézelay in 1146, at the great open-air assembly where Bernard preached to a hillside of thousands, and she did not take it as a passenger. She was Duchess of Aquitaine, and the Knights of Aquitaine and Poitiers made up a great part of the army, her vassals, answering, in a real sense, to her. Later centuries dressed her and her ladies in silver armor for the occasion, riding like Amazons. The records know nothing of it, and we will leave the armor to the storybooks. The truth is grand enough. The Queen of France rode east with the crusade, one of the very few women in history to make that whole journey at the head of anything. They set out in 1147, an enormous column, months of roads and river crossings, to Constantinople, the same golden city our friend Harold had served in as a guardsman a century before, still the largest city in the Christian world, still able to stop a Westerner's breath at first sight of the sea walls and the domes. The emperor received the French king and queen with silken ceremony and polite bottomless suspicion, and moved them along across the narrow water into Asia. And in Asia, the crusade began to go wrong, slowly, from cold and hunger and hard country and worse maps. Know only, from a distance, softly, that in January of 1148, crossing a mountain in what is now Turkey, the strung-out column was badly mauled in the high passes, and many good men did not come down from that mountain, and the king himself barely did. The vanguard that day had been led by one of Eleanor's own vassals, and there were those who let blame drift toward the queen for it, which was unjust, and historians have said so. When things go wrong near a remarkable woman, the age reaches for her name. Battered, the army came down at last to the warm coast and took ship, and in the spring of 1148, Eleanor came to Antioch, and for a few weeks, the whole tone of the story changes, like a window opened on the south. Antioch was a crusader city of gardens and fountains, orange trees and running water, and its prince was Raymond of Poitiers, who was, of all things, her uncle, her father's younger brother, a tall, golden-natured man, only a few years older than she was, raised in the same courts. After a year of frost and mud and grief, she was suddenly home, in the middle of Syria. The chronicles say Raymond honored her extravagantly, and the two of them talked, in their own southern tongue, that Louis's northerners could not follow, and laughed, and were easy together. And Raymond had a plan, and historians say it was the sensible one. He wanted the crusade to strike at the real threat, the Muslim power gathering to the east around Aleppo, the road to fall in Edessa. Louis, whose crusade had never really been strategy at all, but penance, wanted only Jerusalem, the absolution at the end of the pilgrim road, and here the marriage cracked, openly, in front of everyone. Eleanor sided with her uncle, loudly. Louis refused, and Eleanor, whose patience with this good, gray, guilt-ridden man was 15 years old and worn to thread, said the unsayable out loud, that she would stay in Antioch with her own vassals, and that perhaps she and Louis ought not to be married at all, for they were, she noted, cousins. Within the degrees the church forbade, a legal thread we will meet again at Beaugency. The gossips of that age, and the next, said more, said worse, about the queen and her uncle. The sober answer of modern historians is that nobody knows, and that the rumor rests on nothing but the fact that she was dazzling, and he was charming, and they were glad of each other in a bitter year, and that a woman in her position paid for gladness at rates no man was ever charged. We will leave the gossip where it lies. What is documented is sadder and simpler. Louis took her out of Antioch by night, against her will, more or less as baggage, and the crusade went on to Jerusalem and accomplished almost nothing. They laid siege to Damascus for 4 days and gave it up, and the great Second Crusade dissolved into one of the most famous failures of the age. And Raymond of Poitiers, the golden uncle, fell in battle the following summer, defending his little principality, and Eleanor never saw him again. The journey home was its own small odyssey. The king and queen sailed west in separate ships, which by then was a fact you could read 2 ways, and their fleet blundered into a sea war between Byzantium and the Normans of Sicily, and the ships were scattered. And for some weeks, in the summer of 1149, the Queen of France was simply lost at sea, unaccounted for, while the courts of Europe murmured. She turned up at last on the coast of Sicily, ill and exhausted, and made her slow way up Italy, and at Tusculum, the Pope himself received the estranged king and queen, and the Pope, kindly and hopelessly, took it upon himself to mend the marriage. He forbade all talk of the cousinship and the annulment, and he led them, the chronicle says, to a bed he had had prepared and hung with his own precious hangings, and more or less tucked the king and queen of France in together, the most exalted marriage counseling session in the history of Europe. It half worked. A second daughter was born to them the following year, but a marriage cannot live on a pope's furniture, and both of them knew now where the door was. 2 daughters, no son. In that age, for a king, that arithmetic was permission. And in the spring of 1152, at the royal castle of Beaugency, on the Loire, a council of French bishops did what everyone had known for 3 years was coming, and declared the marriage of Louis and Eleanor null, dissolved, as though it had never been, on the grounds of that cousinship, consanguinity, the very thread Eleanor herself had first pulled at Antioch. There was a price, and it was the cruelest one, and we will not pretend it away. The two little girls, Marie and Alex, stayed with their father. That was simply the law of the age. Children of a crown belonged to the crown. But the age's law was no comfort to anybody's heart, and Eleanor rode away from her first marriage, leaving two daughters behind, and she would see almost nothing of them for the rest of her life. Hold that quietly for a moment. This story is full of thrones, but it keeps its griefs where real lives keep them, close in and small and permanent. Now come the 8 weeks that redrew the map of Europe, and the ride through the dark that begins them. Because the moment the bishops at Beaugency said the word, Eleanor was again what she had been at 15, the greatest heiress in Europe, unmarried and in the open. An unmarried duchess could be seized on the road, married at sword point, and the deed would stand. It had happened to other women, so she left Beaugency fast, with a small escort, riding south for her own city of Poitiers, and the vultures were already in the air. Word reached her on the road, the chronicles tell us, that the young Count Theobald of Blois had laid a trap for her at Blois, meaning to marry her by force. She swung wide of it and rode on, at night now. And further south, at a river crossing, a second ambush waited, and this one stings, because it was laid by a boy named Geoffrey of Anjou, the 17-year-old younger brother of the very man she was riding to meet. Warned again, she slipped around him too, by back roads, in the dark, and came safe inside her own walls at Poitiers. Twice hunted in 1 week, and twice too quick, and both times saved by the thing her father had built into her long ago. People told her things. All her life, people told her things. And from Poitiers, safe, she sent a message north. And here's the part that made the whole thing a scandal and a legend. She was not fleeing toward safety. She was fleeing toward a plan. The message went to Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, 19 years old, and it invited him, in effect, to come and marry her. They had met, briefly, the summer before, when Henry and his father had come to the French court. What passed between them then, no chronicle saw. What we know is what happened, and how fast. Henry Plantagenet, at 19, was stocky and freckled, and gray-eyed and red-haired, a young man of frightening energy with a claim, through his mother, the Empress Matilda, to the crown of England itself, and everyone knew he meant to press it. He got Eleanor's message, and he did not hesitate an hour that we know of. 8 weeks after the annulment, in her own cathedral city of Poitiers, in May of 1152, quietly, without bands or pageantry, or anyone's permission, Eleanor of Aquitaine married him. She had been a queen. He was, so far, a duke. On parchment, it was a scandal. In hindsight, it was the shrewdest single decision either of them ever made. Poor Louis. He had, by the annulment, meant to trade a troublesome wife for the chance of a son. What he had actually done, he now saw, was hand the entire southwest of France to the one young man in Europe who already held Normandy and Anjou and might soon hold England, a vassal, now, richer in French land than the French king. He tried a small war about it, and it fizzled, because Henry was faster than everyone. That was the elemental fact of Henry, all his life, and 2 years later, the last piece fell. The English crown, worn out by 20 years of civil war, came to terms. The old king died in the autumn, and in December of 1154, in Westminster Abbey, in the middle of winter, Henry and Eleanor were crowned King and Queen of England. 15, Queen of France. 32, Queen of England. No one else in the history of Europe ever wore both those crowns, and she wore them with a crusade in between. The realm she was now queen of was not really a realm at all. It was an astonishment. England from the Scottish border south, Normandy across the water, Anjou and Maine in the middle, and her own vast Aquitaine down to the Pyrenees. One young couple now held a dominion stretching from the edge of Scotland to the edge of Spain. Historians would later call it the Angevin Empire. It had no capital and no name in its own time. It had, instead, Henry in the saddle, perpetually hurtling from one end of it to the other, a king whose court, one exhausted courtier wrote, moved like a traveling storm, and God alone knew where it would sleep that night. And it had Eleanor. The record, read honestly, shows a working partnership, and for a dozen years or so, a good one. While Henry stormed about the map, Eleanor governed as regent, now in England, now in Normandy, now in Anjou. Writs went out in her name. Justice is reported to her. She presided over the slow machinery a kingdom actually runs on, and the machinery ran. The dazzling southern girl, whom the monks of Paris had thought frivolous, turned out, given an administration to run, to be entirely her father's daughter and her grandfather's granddaughter. She knew people. She remembered them, and she was seen. And all the while came the children. Whatever else that marriage was, it was fruitful on a scale that changed the future of Europe. A son, William I, who died at 3 years old, and we will let that grief pass by quietly, at a distance, the way the records themselves do, one line and a small tomb. Then Henry, called the young king. Then Matilda. Then, in September of 1157, at Oxford, a boy they named Richard, and you know him. He grew up to be Richard the Lionheart, and he was, by every sign, his mother's favorite from the first, the child of Aquitaine, marked from boyhood to inherit her own south. Then Geoffrey, then another Eleanor, then Joanna, then, at the last, in 1166, John. 8 children in 13 years, 5 of them sons, and with her 2 French daughters, 10 in all. Kings would come from them, and queens of Castile and Sicily, and a duchess of Saxony, and in time, through her granddaughter, a saint on the throne of France. There is hardly a royal house in Europe that does not descend from Eleanor of Aquitaine. When historians call her the grandmother of Europe, it is bookkeeping, not poetry. But the partnership had a flaw, and it was the simple, ancient one. Henry shared power with no one, not ministers, not bishops, not sons, and not, in the end, his wife. How that flaw played out with his friend Thomas Becket, whom he made Archbishop of Canterbury, and then broke with, and the terrible thing done in Canterbury Cathedral one December evening in 1170 by knights who believed they did the king's will is one of the most famous stories in England, and it is not tonight's story. We leave it far off, the cathedral dark, the sound turned down, noting only what it meant here. The middle of Henry's reign was a wound, and his family was learning what his enemies already knew, that being close to Henry was a hard place to live. Eleanor had learned it too. By the late 1160s, the marriage had cooled from partnership into distance. Henry took mistresses, as kings did. One of them, a knight's daughter named Rosamond Clifford, he seems to have genuinely loved, and because of that, later centuries wove Rosamond and Eleanor into a lurid legend, the secret bower the maze, the poisoned cup, the jealous queen. Let us be plain by the fire. It is invention, all of it, spun by writers born hundreds of years too late, and no contemporary source lays a hair of harm on Rosamond at Eleanor's door. The young woman died in her own bed at a convent. The truth underneath was quieter and more dignified. The marriage was over in everything but law, and Eleanor, past 45 now, made a decision that tells you who she was. She did not sulk in a tower. She went home. In 1168, with Henry's consent, for the South was restless, and she was the one person the South would obey, Eleanor moved her household back to Poitiers, her grandfather's city, and for 5 years or so, she ruled Aquitaine in her own person as its duchess, with young Richard at her side, being groomed openly as its heir. Her authority ran on her own seal. Her vassals came to her hall. After 30 years of being someone's queen, she was again herself, Eleanor, by the grace of God, Duchess of the Aquitanians. Those 5 years at Poitiers gave rise, afterward, to the most famous legend about her, and because it is famous and lovely, we will hold it up honestly to the light. The legend says that at Poitiers, Eleanor and her daughter Marie of Champagne presided over formal courts of love, where knights and ladies argued fine questions of the heart, and the queen handed down judgments like a supreme court of romance. The legend comes from one witty book, written a generation later by a man who probably never saw Poitiers, and no charter or chronicle places any such tribunal in her hall, and no record even proves that Marie, the daughter she had lost at the annulment, ever came south to join her, though it is tender to imagine, and you may, tonight, if it pleases you. Historians file the courts of love, regretfully, under literature. But here's what is true, and it is better than the legend. Poitiers, under Eleanor, really was one of the bright places of that century. The troubadour tradition her grandfather had begun flowered around her patronage and her daughters after her. The poets of the South sang in her halls and praised her by name, and the great romances of knights and ladies, the very idea, Europe would tell itself, for the next 700 years, grew up in exactly the courts she and her children kept. She did not invent courtly love with a gavel in her hand. She did something realer. She kept the lamps lit and paid the poets and set the tone, and the tone conquered Europe more thoroughly than any army of the age. 5 good years then. Her own land, her own hall, her favorite son beside her, learning the trade, the songs at dinner in her own first language. The story must leave this warm room now, and what comes next is the hard middle of the night, the rebellion and the long captivity. But you already know that the night has a morning, and that she outlives every wall in it. Hold the rail. We go on. The rebellion of 1173 began, as most family catastrophes do, over inheritance, which is to say over love, counted out in land. Henry had crowned his eldest surviving son, young Henry, as a junior king in his own lifetime, a French custom meant to settle the succession. But he gave the young king the title and none of the substance. No lands, no revenues, no real power, a king of nothing, kept on an allowance. Richard had Aquitaine, and Geoffrey had Brittany on the same hollow terms, and their father would not loosen his grip by one finger, and the sons burned. And standing just off stage, patient as winter, was Eleanor's first husband, Louis of France, the young king's father-in-law now, who would gladly hold the coats while Henry's own sons pulled him down. In the spring of 1173, the young king slipped away to Paris, and Richard and Geoffrey followed, and half the baronage of the empire rose with them, and the whole vast Angevin dominion shook, and Eleanor sided with her sons. Stop on that a moment, because it is the hinge of her whole life, and the age could barely process it. Wives did not do this. A queen raising her husband's own heirs against him was, to the 12th century, a thing against nature. Clerics wrote open letters begging her to return to her lord before she unmade the order of the world. Why she did it, no source lets us hear in her own voice, but you have sat with her all evening. You watched Antioch, where she learned what Louis's grip felt like. You watched Poitiers, where for 5 years she governed her own land in her own name and governed it well. And now Henry's grip was closing again over her son's inheritances and over her south. She was 50 years old, and she had been ruled quite enough. The rebellion failed. Henry was, once more, faster than everyone. And in the autumn of 1173, Eleanor was taken on the road, riding, the story goes, for the safety of French territory. One chronicler says she was found dressed in a man's clothes, a detail that may be fact or may be a monk's disapproval made vivid. What is certain is that the king's men brought her to the king, and that Henry, who forgave his sons one by one because he needed his sons, never forgave his wife. The sons got embraces and better allowances. Eleanor got a ship to England and a set of walls. She was held for 16 years, or the whisker short of it that honesty requires, mostly at Sarum, the old castle on its bare chalk hill above Salisbury Plain, and at Winchester, in keeping that was honorable, never a dungeon, a small household, her books, an allowance that grew with the years, but captivity all the same, watched and bounded, her sealed dead, her duchy governed past her, her name simply absent from the rolls of the world she had helped run, year upon year upon year. 51 when the door closed, 67 when it opened. The whole reign of some kings fits inside it. How she endured it, no document records. There is no prison diary, and we will not invent her thoughts for her. We know the shape of the days, the needlework, and the offices, and the small closed round of a watched household on a windy hill, and now and then a flicker in the record, brought down to Westminster for a Christmas court, when politics required the family to be displayed together, then returned. Allowed, for one long stretch, the company of her daughter Matilda, home from Germany in her own exile, the two women lodged together and the allowance raised, a warm lamp in the middle of the gray years, and through the walls, one by one, came the tollings. In 1183, the young king, her eldest surviving son, died of a fever far to the south, in the middle of yet another war against his father, and the chronicles record the one thing about his death that belongs in this story. Dying, he asked his father to show mercy to his mother and to set her free. Henry did not, quite, but the keeping softened after that. The record of her allowances shows it plainly. In 1186, her son Geoffrey died in Paris, a young man still. In the summer of 1189, her daughter Matilda died in Germany. And then, that same July, at Chinon-on-the-Loire, worn out at 56, beaten in his last war by his own son Richard, with the new French king beside him, and having learned at the end, the story famously goes, that even John, his favorite, had joined against him. Henry II, King of England, the fastest man in Europe, stopped. We keep the camera far from that sick room. He was her husband, and the father of her children, and one of the great kings of the age, and he died defeated on a summer's day, and history has been arguing about that marriage ever since. We do not have to hold the trial tonight. Let the record show only this. Of the two of them, one had built a cage and was gone. The other was about to show all Europe what she had been keeping, intact, inside it. Richard was king, and among the first commands of his reign was this one: free the queen. And the messenger who galloped to Winchester to unbar the door found, the old accounts delight in telling us, that the bars were already gone. Her keepers, reading the wind, had released her the moment the old king was dead, and the queen was not waiting in her chamber to be rescued. She was already out, already about the country, already, at 67, back at work. What follows is, by any fair accounting, one of the most extraordinary old ages any human being has ever lived, and the joy of it is that from here to the end, she is never again anyone's prisoner, anyone's pawn, or anyone's wife. Everything she does now, she chooses. Richard was in France when his father died, and for the months until his coronation, his authority in England was, in practice, his mother. She moved from city to city, holding courts, taking oaths of loyalty to her son, settling disputes, fixing the machinery in place, and she opened the prisons. Through all the shires, at her command, went an amnesty. Men held without trial, men held under the old King's Forest laws, for taking a deer, were released. The chronicler who records it adds the reason she gave. She had learned by her own experience, she said, that prisons are bitter to men, and that to be delivered from them is the sweetest refreshment there is. Some rulers hang their hardest lesson on the wall as a warning to others. She turned hers into keys. She organized the coronation, the first great English pageant in a generation. Then, when Richard took the cross and left on the Third Crusade, she took up the role she would hold for the rest of his reign. The still point of the whole empire, the one person whose loyalty was beyond purchase, watching England, watching the coasts, and above all watching John, her own youngest, whose loyalty was a coin that spun. And she traveled. Watch now as an old woman outworks the entire 12th century. Richard needed a wife, and had chosen one, more or less by dispatch. Berengaria, daughter of the King of Navarre, south of the Pyrenees. Someone utterly trustworthy had to go and fetch the bride and deliver her to Richard. Eleanor went. She was close to 70. She crossed the Pyrenees into Navarre, collected the princess, and then brought her, in the dead of winter, over the Alps, an old queen and a young bride, on the mule tracks in the snow, down into Italy, and caught up with the crusade at Messina, in Sicily in the spring, handed over the bride, turned around, and started home. Most great lords of that century thought twice about crossing one mountain range in summer. Then came the disaster that made her, for over a year, the effective ruler of England. Richard, sailing home from the crusade in 1192, was wrecked, took the land route in disguise, and was recognized and seized near Vienna, and sold upward, prince to emperor, until the Holy Roman Emperor himself held the King of England in a castle, and named his price, 150,000 marks of silver, roughly 3 times the yearly revenue of the entire English crown. The phrase, "a king's ransom," means, forever after, this exact bill. Eleanor raised it. The council governed in form, but the drive and the authority were hers. A quarter of every income in England, taken for the king. the gold and silver plate of the churches, inventoried and borrowed, the whole wool crop of the austere white monks, requisitioned. It was harsh, and she knew it, and she did it, because the alternative was her son, in a German castle forever, and John circling the empty throne, with the King of France cheerfully paying the emperor to keep Richard locked away. And while the silver was counted, letters went out from her to the Pope, drafted by the finest Latinist in her service, but speaking in her name, and no one has ever doubted, from her heart, demanding to know why Rome had not moved heaven and earth for a crusader king, taken prisoner on his way home from God's own war. In the salutation of those letters, she is styled with a phrase that has never been forgotten: Eleanor, by the wrath of God, Queen of England, by the wrath of God. Whether the phrase first fell from her lips or her clerk's pen, it wore her fury like a maid glove. And when the silver was gathered, some 35 tons of it, she did not send it. She took it. Past 70 now, in winter, the Queen crossed the sea and traveled up the Rhine with the ransom of England, and was there, in the Emperor's Hall at Mainz, in February of 1194, when the bargain was sealed and her son was set free, into, the chronicle says, the hands of his mother. It had taken 14 months and an empire's whole strength, and the first thing the freed Lionheart did was travel home beside her. One more labor, the quiet one, crowned the rest. John had plotted openly against his captive brother, and the case for crushing him was excellent. Eleanor stood between her 2 living sons and refused the feud. She had watched one generation of this family devour itself. There would not, while she breathed, be another. At her urging, Richard pardoned his brother, and the succession and the peace held for the rest of his reign. Then, at last, at about 72, Eleanor did something she had never once in 60 years been permitted. She stopped. She withdrew to the abbey of Fontevraud, on the border of Anjou, and her own Poitiers, a great convent ruled, it will not surprise you, by a woman, an abbess, and there the Duchess of the Aquitanians folded her hands and watched the river run for 5 whole years, and history, for once, left her alone. It could not last, and you know by now whose story this is. The world always came back for her. In the spring of 1199, word came up the roads to Fontevraud that Richard, campaigning against a rebel vassal far to the south, had been struck by a crossbow bolt at the siege of a small castle called Chalice, an idle wound almost, taken at dusk outside a place of no importance, and that it had festered, and that the great Lionheart was dying of it in his tent, and asking for his mother. She was on the road within hours, 77 years old, and she covered the 100 miles and more fast enough to arrive in time, and that is the fact to keep. He did not die alone among soldiers. He died, on an April evening, in the arms of the person who had loved him longest and first, quietly, his affairs ordered, forgiving, the story says, the boy who had shot him. We stay outside the tent, on the dark hillside, with the campfires burning low. Inside, an old woman held her favorite son, and the age of the Lionheart ended, not with trumpets, but at the pace of a pulse, gently, going, gone. She brought him home to Fontevraud, and buried him in the abbey church at the feet of his father, the son a stone's length from the man he had fought half his life, both of them quiet now, and quiet together, which is a thing only churches and long time can accomplish. And before that same terrible year was out, her daughter Joanna, widowed Queen of Sicily, died as well, asking with her last strength to be veiled as a nun of Fontevraud, and it was granted, and she was buried among the sisters, 2 children 1 year, laid down in one abbey. Of the 10, there were now 2, John, King of England, and Eleanor, Queen of Castile, far away over the mountains in Spain. A woman of 77, so bereaved, has earned any rest she cares to claim. Instead, watch her one more time, for the last labors are the ones the historians shake their heads over most. John's crown was contested, and his empire creaking. To steady her south, the old queen came out of Fontevraud and made a progress through Aquitaine, city by city, charter by charter, binding her vassals to her son, and then did a thing almost without precedent. She traveled to the King of France, her first husband's son, and did homage to him for Aquitaine with her own hands in his, because a duchy she held in her own right was a duchy no quarrel of kings could lawfully touch. It was her last great legal masterstroke, and it held. And then there was a peace to seal between England and France, and peaces in that world were sealed with a marriage. A granddaughter of Eleanor's, one of the Castilian princesses, was to marry the heir of France. Someone had to go to Castile, choose the right girl, and bring her back 700 miles over the Pyrenees in winter. 2 kingdoms agreed. There was exactly one person whose judgment no one would dare dispute. In her 78th year, closing on 80, Eleanor of Aquitaine crossed the Pyrenees in the snow season, was received in state by her daughter, the Queen of Castile, whom she had not seen in decades, wintered there among her grandchildren, and made her choice. There is a story, told afterward, that the choice came down to the sound of a name, that the elder girl was Urraca and the younger Blanca, and that Eleanor judged France could not love a Queen Urraca, but would take Blanca, Blanche, to its heart. It is probably a minstrel's polish on a plainer truth, that the old queen looked at 2 granddaughters and knew which one could rule. Either way, listen to how the choice came out. The girl she picked, Blanche of Castile, whom the old queen personally escorted back over the mountains that spring, became Queen of France, twice governed France as regent, in the very mold of her grandmother, and raised a son who became King Louis IX, Saint Louis, the one king of France who is also a saint of the church. On such a journey, made by such a woman at such an age, that much of the future road. She meant, then, truly, to be done. She returned to Fontevraud, but the wars of John found her even there, and the last adventure of her life, in her 80th year, is the strangest of all. Caught at the little castle of Mirbeau by a rebel army led, of all people, by her own grandson, Arthur of Brittany, a boy of 15 with a claim to John's crown. She refused every demand, withdrew into the keep, and held it, an 80-year-old woman commanding the defense of the last tower, while her messenger slipped out through the lines to find John. And John, in the one lightning stroke of his whole unhappy reign, covered 80 miles in 2 days, and took the besiegers in Tyre, at dawn, with his mother safe in the middle of them. The boy Arthur passed into his uncle's keeping, and the record goes dark here, out of history. No one can say with certainty what became of him, and the guesses do John no credit, and we will leave that door closed, for it is his stain, not hers. Her part of the story is simply this. The last time the world of men came for Eleanor of Aquitaine with an army, she was 80 years old, and she shut the gate, and she won. And then, at very long last, the quiet. She went back to Fontevraud, and this time nothing followed her in. The abbey folded around her, The bells in the offices, the cloister and the river light, the garden going around its slow year, the world she had filled for so long began, gently, to let go of her, and she of it. And at the end, the records of the abbey tell us, she did the thing that still catches the breath a little. Eleanor, Duchess of the Aquitainians, Queen of France, Queen of England, took the veil and was received as a nun of Fontevraud, finishing her life inside the one institution of her age where the ruler of the house was always, by rule, a woman. She died there on the first day of April, 1204, 82 years old or thereabouts, in her bed, in peace, with the sisters about her. Reckon, one last time, what she had outlasted. 2 husbands, both kings, 8 of her 10 children, the Pope who tucked her into bed at Tusculum, and the abbot who preached her crusade, Becket and Rosamond and the emperor who priced her son, every rival, every jailer, every man who had ever decided what was to be done with her. The girl of 15, from the wedding at Bordeaux, was the last one standing, and she left the stage only when the whole cast had gone home, like a good hostess, lamps out, doors fastened, nothing left undone. The nuns who had known her wrote her obituary in the abbey's register, and they had seen queens before, and they chose their words. A queen, they wrote, who surpassed almost all the queens of the world, almost all. Even in grief, the sisters kept their scholarly caution, and one likes to think Eleanor would have approved the almost most of all. They buried her in the abbey church between Henry and Richard, the husband on one side, the son on the other, keeping, in death, the peace she had spent her last strength making them keep in life. And on her tomb, the carvers made her likeness and gave it the one detail no queen's effigy had carried before, the detail this story has been sailing toward since the first minute. The kings around her lie with scepters. Eleanor lies with a book, held open, forever mid-page. Stone queens sleep. This one reads, 800 years of visitors have walked into that quiet church and understood the message without a word of Latin. The story is not over. I am only at a good part. Go softly on your way. So, let the story settle now. The way supper settles, the way a great house settles at night, into the warm dark. A girl on a balcony above the Garonne, 15 years old, a candle in the window, a hot July wedding in Bordeaux, and a crown by summer's end. The gray island palace in Paris, and the songs of the south sung defiantly in the cold. The road to Jerusalem, the golden city on the water, the orange garden in Antioch, where she remembered who she was, the abbey table at Beaugency, where a marriage was folded up like a letter, and the night rides afterward, twice hunted, twice too quick, the message north, and the 19-year-old who did not hesitate, and 8 weeks that redrew the map. Westminster in the snow, 8 children in 13 years, the lamps of Poitiers, and the poet singing, and then the long gray, 16 years on the chalk hill, the needle, and the small window, and the tollings coming through the wall, and then the door opening, and the old woman coming out, not diminished but distilled, opening the prisons because she knew, raising a ransom in silver by the ton, crossing the Alps in winter, crossing the Pyrenees at almost 80, holding the last tower, choosing the granddaughter who would mother a saint, and at the end of all of it, a plain habit, a narrow bed, a slow river, bells, and a stone likeness with an open book, reading on the far side of everything. She outlived them all, and here's the gentle secret the whole evening has been keeping. It was never really stamina. It was that she treated every single room they shut her in, palace or crusader tent, or prison tower or cloister, as a place worth being fully alive in, and so no room ever got the better of her. Not once, in 82 years. Your own day is done too. Whatever it held, it is held now. The doors of it are closed, and you do not have to stand guard over them tonight. The fire here is low and easy. The wind is only the poplars by the river, turning over their leaves in their sleep. Far off, an abbey bell is counting something, but it is not counting anything of yours. In the dark church, the lamps are banked, the kings are quiet, and the old queen reads on, patient, unhurried, keeping her page as she has kept it for 800 years, and she will keep it for you too, whenever you want this story again. Sleep now. Good night. History will keep till morning.